now onto the topic of healing in the Jewish tradition, and as with all the religious and spiritual traditions, we're going to be looking at this is a vast, ancient body of knowledge, and so obviously I'm just touching on a few of the central concepts in relation to health and healing. Some of you who've studied religion will know that Judaism has a number of different denominations within it, and so their attitudes will vary, but I'm focusing on attitudes that are shared across pretty much all the Jewish denominations in this lecture. I want to start out by looking at Jewish attitudes to the body, and as I think you've probably realized doing the metaphor exercise, this is something we tend not to think about very consciously most of the time, and where those attitudes come from. So it's impossible to understand any attitude to healing without understanding the cultural view of the body. And as we noted at the beginning, how we conceptualize the body has a lot to say about how healing will be understood. So our current very common view of the body as a machine or as a car has far-reaching implications for how we organize healthcare, attitude to pharmacology, attitudes to death and dying. So if, for instance, I understand the human body as a chemical accident, I will not hesitate to use other chemicals to manipulate it, as it has no particular value. Whereas if I see it as sacred, the approach will look very different at every point in the life cycle. So when we look at Judaism, we need to go right back to Genesis, which is, some of you already know, the first book of the Hebrew Bible. And so I just wanted to look at a quote by Rabbi Bradley Shavit here. So he says, biblical and rabbinic tradition maintain that our bodies reflect God's image and therefore command respectful maintenance. In addition, our bodies are not our property, but God's. We use them as the tenants and stewards of God's possessions, but ultimately our bodies must be returned well tended to their original owner. So here we see two very important aspects of the attitude to the body and then to health. So if we look at the creation story in Genesis, the breath of life is breathed into Adam by God, and so Judaism has the belief that human beings are created in the image of God, and therefore that makes sense that the body and the human being partakes of that aspect of the sacred. So because the body is sacred and partakes of the sacred, it has to be treated respectfully, just as we treat God respectfully. And this is an interesting part of it also, that we don't own our body, it belongs to God, and therefore it needs to be returned to God in good condition at the end of our lives. And so this is obviously a very, very different attitude to a more mechanical, secular attitude, where we see that Jewish people see the body as sacred, and so you have to take care of it. So it's not too difficult to see then how that's going to impact on health and attitudes to health. So there's been no central authority within Judaism since the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem in 70 CE. So as a result, there are a wide variety of views within the tradition of Judaism, and lively debate is in fact encouraged. So the acceptance of argument and debate is a hallmark of the rabbinic Jewish tradition. So related to this fact is that while Israel is officially a Jewish state and home to over 8 million Jews, a large amount of the world's Jewish population lives in places like the United States and Canada. So there's a very large Jewish diaspora, and so attitudes are shaped obviously by the culture in which Jewish people are living, as well as their own religious views. So as I said, I'm going to focus on the points that tend to be shared, so particularly coming from the Bible itself. And so we find in the earliest parts of the Bible that, so I'll just read from this. When Miriam was stricken with leprosy, Moses beseeched God to heal his sister, saying a remarkably brief prayer, "Please God, please heal her." So I'm going to be coming back to this, but this becomes one of the first prayers for the sick within the Jewish tradition that would be shared by all Jewish people who obviously share the same holy book. And so we're going to see that this continues to be used as a template for healing prayer within the tradition. To note that when we start to look at the Bible in terms of healing and looking for those aspects of the Bible that talk about healing, it's actually present throughout. And so just one example I'll give is of Elisha and Elijah in the Hebrew Bible are part of their work as prophets is to heal the sick, and in some cases even to raise the dead. So I'm going to look at the example of Elisha here. This is a painting from the 19th century of Elisha raising a dead child back to life. This passage is from 2 Kings 32 to 37. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house, and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite." So he called her, and then she came to him, and he said, "Pick up your son." She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. So, of course, this is extremely dramatic story, and I think it's unfamiliar to a lot of people because, again, we're often not focusing on the healing aspects found within the Bible, although they're all throughout. And so this is the story of Elisha actually raising a child from the dead. And so clearly from this passage, we can see that the power is coming from God. So the prophet is praying to God, and God then raises the child from the dead. The development of the Jewish tradition over time has been commentary on the Bible and the development of Jewish law, both oral and written law. And so one of the groupings of texts is the Mishnah. And so I'm drawing on that for this section. Also the Talmud, so collections of writings by rabbis that develop the Jewish tradition. Now, of course, when you have a holy book that's written thousands of years ago, it has to be made current. And so these commentators are using biblical principles to speak about issues in the contemporary world. And so we find in the Talmud and the Mishnah the attitudes to the body, again building on that idea that the body is sacred. And so many of the rabbis are talking about, for instance, the necessity for cleanliness. And again, as I mentioned, as we looked at the Egyptian and the ancient Greek case, the idea that physical cleanliness is linked to spiritual cleanliness. And this is a very common characteristic across religious traditions, that those two are linked. So you have to keep yourself kind of morally and spiritually clean, but also physically clean. And so that's an aspect of the tradition. Also, that you have to respect the body, your own body, and the body of others. It's also believed within mainline Jewish tradition that a healthy body allows the person to serve the will of God. And so it's incumbent upon you to take care of it so that you can then serve the will of God. So in this quote, this is a very famous quotation from the Mishnah. You'll hear it quoted all the time in the Jewish community. So, whoever destroys a single life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed the whole world, and whoever saves a single life is considered by Scripture to have saved the whole world. So you couldn't put it more clearly, the Jewish attitude to human life, and that to save one human life is considered to save the whole world. And as I said, I've heard this quoted many, many times in the Jewish tradition into the contemporary period. These ideas about the sacrality of the body, this also then implicates attitudes to death and dying and rituals around burial. And so typically within observant Jewish communities, we find a society called the Hevra Kadisha, which literally means holy society that oversees the care of the dead person. And so you can see in this photo, these are Hasidic Jews, and so the body's wrapped in a shawl, so it's in a sacred garment, and typically a group of men and women will wash the body. Men for men, women for women, will wash the body and say prayers over the body. And traditionally, the person's never left alone. There's a guardian called a shomer that oversees the process until the burial. So we can see that right up into the end, the body is treated as something that's sacred. Now, I'm going to attach to Blackboard a short video on this, so you can, that's been produced by the UGA Federation in New York, and you can get a sense of this. When trying to figure out why religious people tend to be healthier both physically and mentally, I think it comes into focus pretty quickly why this might be the case when we start to look at aspects of these traditions. And so, for instance, many of you will know in the Bible that in Genesis it said that on the seventh day God rested. And so the idea of the Sabbath is created as a result of that. Our whole system is based on this, the 7-day week. And so traditionally in Judaism, you rest from the evening of Friday till Saturday. And so we find in Hebrews 9:11 this idea of it's an obligation to rest. So there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. And so we see this biblical template and then how that gets lived out in a Jewish life. And so it's very common for practicing Jews, it's obligatory if you're practicing Jew to uphold the Sabbath, to rest, and also we can see that this connects to health, and we know we're in an epidemic in North American culture of overworking. And I've done surveys of my students, and many of them are working 7 days a week, either at work or at school. And so we know this is a problem for physical health, that the body and the mind need rest. And so it's very, I think, important to note that religions often make this obligatory, that we rest for periods of time. The observances of Sabbath is to have a Sabbath dinner every week, and I know this remains a very common practice in Jewish communities. So I'm just going to read from a description. On Friday evening he comes home. He finds the candlestick with 7 candles lighted, and the table covered with a fair white cloth. And he puts away his packs and cares, and he sits down to the table with his squinting wife and yet more squinting daughter, and eats fish with them. Fish that has been dressed with garlic sauce, and sings there with the grandest psalms of David, and rejoices with his whole heart over the deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt. So the idea that this is a sacred meal, and so there are prayers, so the Psalms from the Bible, the Psalms of King David, and that he's rejoicing regarding the story of Exodus in the Bible, the escape of the children of Israel out of Egypt. And so every week this gets reinscribed. And so we can see that the Sabbath is serving many, many functions here. I don't want to, obviously this is a religious concept, but even if we look at it sociologically, we can see that how important this is for somebody who's working hard to just sit down one night of the week at least and have a proper meal with their family and community. Shabbat dinner typically includes particular elements. So as we saw in that quotation, the idea of lighting candles, so there's a ritual element to it, and this is generally overseen by the woman of the house. And so Jewish women play a key role obviously in these rituals that uphold the tradition. And so you can see the challah bread, some of you may have had that. And so there's particular dishes that are eaten, and when you get into the high holidays like Passover, it's even more elaborated, but each Sabbath encapsulates these certain kinds of foods and offers these certain kinds of foods associated with the Jewish tradition. I picked this photograph because it illustrates that often at Shabbat dinner, it's intergenerational, so grandparents, parents, and children is typical. Also, friends may be invited. And so in my other course on ritual and ceremony, I talk about this in much more detail, but sociologist Amitai Etzioni has been ringing the alarm bells regarding how we're losing these kind of practices. And so we're seeing a lot of burnout, for instance. And so we're also seeing less cohesion within families. And so again, I've asked this question, I just ask you to reflect on it. Did you eat as a family? And so this is a practice that, in my understanding, is becoming less common because people are rushing out to activities in the evening. Typically, years ago, you would eat with your family every evening, pretty much like clockwork. And so Etzioni has argued that we need to reinvigorate these practices so that it holds families and communities together to eat together regularly. It's one of the main ways that we socialize and keep our bonds with people. And so I had looked at an interview with a writer who had written a book called The Year of Living Biblically. And he was a secular Jew, not particularly devout, and he had decided to live as a Jewish person, following all the rules. And some of it was for comedic value, like, so for instance, he was sitting in Central Park in New York with a pocket full of stones looking for an adulterer. I mean, some of it was just for comedic value. But what he said in the interview was, at the end of the whole practice, what he was going to keep from it was keeping the Sabbath, or the Shabbat. And so he said, as a freelance writer, he could write and he can work anytime, all the time. And so he decided to take the traditional Jewish day of rest to be with his family and to focus on family and friends and relaxation. Maimonides, as a way of looking at certain aspects of Jewish philosophy in relation to health and also to ideas of the good doctor. Most of the world's traditions have a great respect for doctors, but if I were to call it, I would say probably the Jewish tradition more than any. Obviously, someone could argue with me about that, but certainly there's a tremendous respect for doctors and physicians within the Jewish community, and being a doctor is seen as something very, very kind of a noble profession. Again, because it slots in very neatly with that idea of the sacrality of human life and protecting human life. And so Moses Maimonides was born in Islamic Spain, in Cordoba, and this image is actually a statue of him that's been erected in Cordoba. There's a long history here of anti-Semitism, and so the Jews were actually driven out of Spain, and Maimonides had to flee to Egypt. So that's a whole story that's been ongoing for the Jewish community, and we can't ignore that if we're going to talk about health, your actual physical survival has often been in danger in the Jewish community, obviously the most tragic being the Holocaust in the 20th century. And so, Maimonides very much part of this ongoing anti-Semitism against Jews, and so was forced to flee. But he is considered to be the foremost philosopher and intellectual of medieval Judaism, and I would say probably even into the present. And he was also a physician, and so again we see, as in ancient Greece, and Jewish ideas of medicine were influenced by the ideas of ancient Greece. The idea that the doctor should also be an intellectual and be part of the community. This remains a very important ideal within the Jewish idea of the physician. Many influential texts, the most important being the Guide for the Perplexed, which remains a foundational document within Western philosophy. It's taught in almost all schools of philosophy in the West at some point. And so he's influenced, he was translated into Latin, and he influenced greater Western culture as a result, and also Islamic culture. And so Maimonides, this oath is associated with Maimonides. As I said, he was a practicing physician himself. And so it's written here, "The eternal providence has appointed me to watch over the life health of thy creatures. May the love of my art actuate me all the time. May neither avarice, nor miserliness, nor thirst for glory, or for a great reputation engage my mind. For the enemies of truth and philanthropy could easily deceive me and make me forget my lofty aim of doing good to thy children. Okay, so you can see the similarity to the Hippocratic Oath here. So let me just work through this a little bit. This idea of providence. So again, that all things that happen are decided by God. And again, we find this idea of medicine as an art, not just a rational activity, it's also an art. And again, there's clearly a discomfort around the idea that perhaps doing it for money or doing it for glory, that shouldn't be the motivation for being a physician. May I never see the patient as anything but a fellow creature in pain. Grant me the strength, time, and opportunity always to correct what I have acquired, always to extend its domain. For knowledge is immense, and the spirit of man can extend and indefinitely enrich itself daily with new requirements. So again, that idea of constantly expanding one's knowledge, and that this is an ever-evolving process. And this is very much part of Jewish culture, this respect for education, that you're continually educating yourself. Today we can discover his errors of yesterday, and tomorrow he can obtain a new light on what he thinks himself sure of today. O God, thou hast appointed me to watch over life and death of thy creatures. Here am I ready for my vocation, and now I turn unto my calling. So this is an oath, as we saw with the Hippocratic Oath, so the doctor would say it in front of a group of people. It's binding. And so we see this idea of being appointed by God, that this is directly related to the divine, and it comes with a great deal of responsibility. So again, that idea of vocation and calling, that the practice of medicine is much more than just a career or a way to make money. It's actually in service to God and to community.